and thank you for your attention. This is a very sombre topic, World War II. It's perhaps the worst of all events that have occurred in modern history, perhaps world history, from a human suffering point of view. So tonight, we don't want to be fascinated by that. We're not going to go into and delve into the drama of the Holocaust too much. We know a lot of what happens, so we want to take it from the Bible's point of view. At face value, the story that we're about to embark on spans 6 years and 1 day, World War II, from the 1st of September 1939 to the 2nd of September 1945. 1st of September 1939 marks the invasion of Poland by Germany, triggering war declarations by Britain and France in the following days. But that doesn't tell the whole story. To start an investigation of World War II from that moment would be akin to starting an investigation of a murder at the moment the knife plunges into the heart of the victim. What actually caused that fateful strike? What were the events that occurred up to and around it? Why did it occur? We could travel further back in time to find out when it all happened, but we're going to focus more on the Bible's perspective. We could go back to each of the cause and effect all the way through World War I and earlier, but there was a bigger picture involved here. All history flows together as one continuous stream, and it is all part of God's wider plan. Many of the terrible events in and around World War II were predicted in the Bible, and our God can see time like a map, from beginning to end, stretching out before him. Knowing what will happen, he influences and shapes events to bring the earth to his final destination, which is the kingdom of God on earth. And that's a subject for another night, hopefully a more exciting and a more joyful night. Tonight our focus is on World War II. As we said, let's not ogle at war tonight. Instead, we'll focus on the parts of the war that are important to God. Anyone familiar with the Bible will be aware that it centres around the history and the future of the nation of Israel. Right back in Genesis chapter 12, God made a promise to Abraham, the forefather of the Jews. And he said, "I will make of thee a great nation, and will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So right there, that was talking about Israel. Abraham was the forefather of Israel. So it's going to be a great nation, and those that bless Israel will be blessed, those that curse Israel, cursed. This promise of God has a greater effect on World War II than any of those that modern historians would write down leading up to World War II, like the Versailles Treaty or the rise of Nazi Germany. This was the selection of Israel as God's people. This is what's important to God. And let's focus a little more on Israel as God's people. 430 years after that promise, Israel was officially constituted a nation with its own laws directly from God. And God said, "Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself." And then he said, "If you obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, you'll be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. You'll be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And 40 years later again, when the nation of 2 million people was ready to end their nomadic existence and settle permanently in the land which we now know as Israel, God reiterated that they were special to him. "The Lord shall establish thee an holy people unto himself." And critically in this quote, it says, "All people of the earth shall see that thou art called by the name of the Lord." That is very important. We're going to pick up that theme and keep bearing back to the name of God throughout tonight's lecture, because it explains one of the main reasons that God seemingly arbitrarily chose this group of people to be his holy or special people. By choosing them and working miracles through them, all the people of the earth would see God through them. you notice it says, all people of the earth would see that thou art called by the name of the Lord, or as the Hebrew would say, the name Yahweh, God's name. Why, though, is Yahweh's name important in this context? What does it mean for Israel to be called by God's special name, Yahweh? Before I explain that further, I'll just go on to one more quote which adds to the picture. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 22 and 23. And David, after receiving a promise from God himself, is praising God and saying how great God is. There's none like thee, neither is there any beside thee. We'll come back to that concept as well, which we'll see throughout Isaiah. But he says, and what one nation in the earth is like thy people Israel, even whom God went to redeem for a people to himself and to make him a name. And it again reiterates later that this is thy people Israel. This event of making him a name when he brought Israel out of Egypt is very linked to the previous quote as well. God saved Israel from slavery in Egypt to make him a name. So from Deuteronomy, the previous quote, Israel would be called by his name. And from this quote in Samuel, Israel was chosen to make God a name. But what's important about this name, though? A name is a label for someone or something. It would be difficult to refer to someone if they didn't have a name. But at the same time, names are something more. Let me just list off a few names for you and just think about them. Greg, Tiffany, Janine, Mitchell, Yang, Eve, Jesus, Constantine, Chris, Elizabeth, Trevor, Yahweh. All of those names would have conjured up a picture in your head. Perhaps you liked or disliked the name due to the image that was created. Names begin then to morph into something more powerful than just a label. They contain character, appearance, environment. You've probably heard someone say they're going to make a name for themselves if something. Names become synonymous with reputation. They already had a name. They weren't going to make a new name. It's meaning they're going to make a reputation for themselves. And nowhere in all the world's literature do names have more meaning than in the Bible. In fact, many Hebrew names are everyday words or phrases. If you were to talk about your friend Jonah, you would be using the same word as dove. To talk about Caleb or Nabal, you would use the same word as your dog or a fool. But the most important name in the Bible is undoubtedly God's name, Yahweh, meaning he who will be. That doesn't seem on face value to instantly be anything meaningful. He who will be what is the question? Well, that's another whole topic which we could talk about, how God pairs titles with his name to show what he will be. But at its simplest, his name is a statement of purpose and promise for the future. He will always be, he will always exist, and it contains will. It's a promise for the future. He will always keep his promises to his people. So his name is his reputation that he wants the world to know about him. When Israel then were chosen to bear the name of God, they had a very privileged but a very grave responsibility to represent God to all the people of the earth. If people could look at Israel and they could see God's name, if they could look at Israel and see God's promises to Abraham being kept by God, then Israel was fulfilling God's purpose with them. And that's why, also in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God gave another reason for why he chose Israel. He says, "For thou art an holy people unto Yahweh thy God. Yahweh hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." And then it explains, Yahweh did not choose you. He did not set his love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, because you were the fewest of all people, but because Yahweh loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath Yahweh brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen from the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. Israel were chosen to show the world that Yahweh would keep the oath that he had promised to their fathers. He had sworn that oath, and he wanted his reputation to be known, that he's a God that keeps his promises, a God who always has been and always will be the same. He had sworn to Abraham that he would make a great nation out of him, and so he would keep that promise. If he broke the promise, his name would be tarnished, and all people of the earth would no longer trust him. If you come with me to Isaiah 43, it expands this idea, and then we'll jump back into the history of World War II and see how it relates. In Isaiah 43, verse 9, God creates a sort of courtroom scene, and he challenges all nations to come before him and bring their own witnesses. He says, "Let all the nations be gathered together, and let the people be assembled. Who among them can declare this and show us former things? Let them bring forth their witnesses that they may be justified, or let them hear and say, truth." And now he's talking to Israel. "Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I am Yahweh, and beside me there is no Saviour. I have declared and have saved, and I have showed, when there was no strange God among you. Therefore ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, that I am God." So Israel are witnesses to the fact that God exists and that he is the one true, the only true God. That's the same concept of Israel bearing God's name, bearing God's reputation. They were witnesses to everyone around that God was the only true God and that he would keep his promises. And this idea that God is the only true God is found throughout Isaiah 43 to 48. It constantly comes up with this same theme: I am Yahweh and there is none else. If you want to colour them in, they jump off the page as you're going through. For instance, after Isaiah 43 verse 11, Isaiah 44 verse 6, at the end, "I am the first and I am the last, and beside me there is no God." Is there, at the end of verse 8, "Ye are even my witnesses. Is there a God beside me? Yea, there is no God, I know not any." And 45 verse 5, "I am Yahweh and there is none else. There is no other God beside me." And it goes on and on and on. The purpose of Israel was for everyone to know and see that that God was alive and he's the only true God. When you look at Israel, you're to see God and to see his name, his holy reputation. So we'll come back to this in a moment, but let's hit pause here and fast forward 3,400 years to the 1900s. The National Socialist, or Nazi Party, filled a void in the consciousness of the proud German people after World War I. At the end of World War I, in June 1919, the Versailles Treaty was signed, which stated that the Germans would have to pay reparations and that they would be reduced to a country that had no national identity, no force in Europe. If they had come out victorious, they could have been the jewel of Europe, but instead they were in poverty. Half of their country was taken from them, and their army was limited to a laughable size. So, when Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, he was a figurehead for Germans to become great again. They could rebuild, they could become the rulers of Europe. That was his message. But with that came some catches for certain members of German society. In 1933, Dachau was established, the first German concentration camp, and this was mainly for political dissidents, those who opposed the Nazi Party. But by 1933, it became personal against the Jews. Jewish boycotting began throughout from April through, well, really to the end of the Third Reich. The books written by Jews were burned. Jews were not allowed to hold civil service or unity or state positions, and Jews from Eastern Europe specifically were stripped of their German citizenship. And then these were put into actual law in effect with the Nuremberg laws, September 1935. Jews could no longer be considered German citizens at all. Jews could not marry so-called pure-blood Germans, Aryans, and they couldn't fly the German flag. By 1938, 1936, there were forced 1938, there were forced seizures, forced emigration and seizures of assets of Jews, like businesses, property, and things like that. And then the first military action occurred. Germany marched into the Rhineland in 1936, that's a little earlier, and they were making overtures about taking Czechoslovakia. And so the rulers of Great Britain and France got together with the rulers of Germany and said, we'll make an agreement, you can take part of Czechoslovakia, because the part you really want is the German-speaking part just on the border. It's called the Sudetenland. And you can have the Sudetenland. Interestingly, Czechoslovakian leaders weren't present and they didn't have any say in it. But they said, you can have Sudetenland if you promise that you won't take anything else. And Hitler very nicely agreed that he promised he wouldn't take anything else if he could just have that. And so if I go back one, I'm going to have to skip through all of them. But the image that showed previously was of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who came back to Britain, and there's a famous picture of him at the airport holding a piece of paper in his hand, which is of the peace agreement, the Munich Agreement, and it'll show up in a second. And at that moment, he pronounced one of the most ironic speeches of all time, and the key sort of "I have a dream" phrase of that speech was, "There shall be peace for our time," and it became iconic as one of the worst speeches of all time, because less than a year later it would be the very opposite. Later that year, in November, was Kristallnacht, which was basically one night called the Night of Broken Glass, where basically all the German citizens rose up against the Jews and destroyed their businesses, looted their houses. It became the Night of Broken Glass because there was so much glass on the ground from the breaking of windows that that was the most noticeable thing about that night, the crunch of glass underfoot. 200 synagogues were destroyed, 7,500 Jewish shops looted, and 30,000 male Jews were sent to concentration camps, although many of those were later released. You may have heard of Eddie Jacob, who wrote a book called The Happiest Man Alive, and he was one of those taken on that night and sent to a concentration camp himself, but though later released. He's an Australian, he died in 2020, but he was one of the longest survived Holocaust survivors in Australia. So in November 1938, as well, all Jewish students were expelled from schools, so no more education. And then soon after that, the Third Reich, levied a 1 billion marks fine on the Jews for all of the destruction caused during Kristallnacht. And then the invasion of Poland. This marks the beginning of World War II, because France and Britain had pacts with Poland, and they declared war on Poland in response to Germany's invasion. But within just a couple of months of the invasion of Poland, ghettos were established in Poland, which were small areas where all of the Jews had to be contained within a city. So, for instance, one of the most famous of these was the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Jews made up a quarter of the population of the city, 500,000 Jews sealed within a 1.34 square mile radius, which is small, which is about or a little bigger than the size of Adelaide CBD, a very, very small area of the capital of Poland at the time. And then by the next year, 1940, Germany occupies Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, which is Luxembourg, Belgium, and Netherlands, and France. And that happened so unbelievably quickly that everyone was astonished. They were used to World War I warfare, where a 500-metre dash into the next line of trenches was considered a success. But within less than a month, France was taken, and the British forces were evacuated from the port of Dunkirk to, hopefully, at the time they were thinking, to fight another day. The thing to remember about every place that Germany took is that the moment they took a place, they started to implement the same anti-racial laws against the Jews as well. So, and the same with the countries that they had pacts with. So by this point, their land looked something like this. They didn't control Italy directly, but they had agreements with Italy, and Italy implemented the same anti-racial laws. So all of these countries were under Nazi control, and as we'll see later, the vast majority of Jews in Europe didn't survive because of the amount of land that the Nazis controlled. So to continue on, in April 1940, the most famous of the concentration camps, Auschwitz, was established, where 950,000 Jews, over 1.2 million actually in the end, lost their lives. In 1941, essentially all of continental Europe is Nazi. The Nazis have turned the tide on, or have turned the tables on the Soviets, who they earlier had a pact with, and pushed all the way to almost the gates of Moscow. And what we would know as continental Europe is under Nazi control. Then later, during that time, Jewish massacres are commonplace, but in 1942 is what's known as the final solution. There's a conference in Berlin where the plan is outlined to murder all of Europe's Jews. Hitler's ideal was the extinction of European Jewry. And by the end of 1942, in Belzec, 600,000 Jews were killed. By the end of 1943, 250,000 were murdered in Sobibor, and the list goes on and on and on. They were so fanatic about this that when the tide of the war started to turn in 1943, and they could see the Russians and the other allies coming back on them, they started to liquidate all of the ghettos to speed up this process, as if it was more important than the very act of the survival of the German state. So when ghettos were liquidated, all members of the ghettos were sent to concentration camps. And then in 1943, in January that year, was the first defeat by the Russians at Stalingrad. And in 1944 was D-Day, which was the largest amphibious landing in history of the Allies on the beaches in northern France. The first of the killing centres was liberated in July 1944 by the Russians, and they saw such horrible things that they couldn't believe their eyes. They invited journalists in to make sure that all of the horrors were documented, and when they shared that with the Allies believed somewhat the extent, but they couldn't believe what the Russians were recounting had happened in these places. They thought that they were exaggerating it. But the Germans were still determined to both kill all of the Jews and hide the evidence. So they started to march from the concentration camps in the outer ring of the territory they'd gained, march them into inner concentration camps in the centre of Germany. And most of the Jews on those death marches didn't survive because many of them were were so malnourished and undernourished that they weighed less than 30 kilograms and were expected to march hundreds and hundreds of kilometres. Those who fell were shot on the spot. And by May 1945, the end of the war, Germany surrenders. Holocaust means a thing completely burnt. To understand the horrors of the Holocaust, let me just read a few powerful quotes from Holocaust survivors and other writers. These don't go into the actual details, but just the poetic nature of them can help you to understand what happened. Elie Wiesel said, "Listen to the tears of children. Look and listen as they quietly walk towards flames so gigantic that the planet itself seemed in danger." Another person said, "There are no children in the ghetto, only small Jews." Sergeant Horace Evers of the US Army, when he first saw it, wrote back a letter and said, "How could people do things like that? I never believed they could until now." From the journal of an unknown victim of the concentration camps, "We hang the discs on our wrists. From that moment, we are registered citizens in the city of human suffering." Primo Levi said, "Then for the first time we became aware that our language lacks words to express this offence, this demolition of a man. We had reached the bottom. It is not possible for man to sink lower than this. Nothing belongs to us anymore. They have taken away our clothes, our shoes, even our hair. They will take away even our name." 16-year-old Alice Locke Kahana wrote, after the war and her reflections at the time, "The flames killed the soul of all men. Silence was the answer of the free man. The shadows at night talked to me. Why are you not mad? They questioned me." By the end of the war, 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe were murdered. In Poland, perhaps 1 in 10 survived. How can this happen? If Paul was present now, he may well pose the same question he asked in Romans 11, verse 1 and 2. Hath God cast away his people? But he would still have the same answer. Definitely not. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. But if Israel were God's people, how could this happen? God swore an oath that he would always be with Abraham's seed, that Israel would always be his people who he would care for. Israel would bear his name. Come to Jeremiah chapter 7 for an answer to this. Remember, Israel is bearing God's name. In Jeremiah 7, we can see some of the things that they've done. Let's go from verse 30. For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, saith Yahweh. They have set their abominations in the house, which is called by my name, to pollute it. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. That right there describes what Israel was doing at the time. And notice at the end of verse 30, these horrible atrocities that they were committing against their own children, they were doing in the name of God. So God's name was being associated with these horrible practices. The one true God they were meant to be witnessing to, the world now sees as a God condoning abominable practices, burning their own children in the name of Yahweh. And so the punishment will come. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that it shall no more be called Tophet, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they shall bury in Tophet till there be no place. And the carcasses of this people shall be meat for the fowls of the heaven and for the beasts of the earth, and none shall fray them away. Then will I cause to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land shall be desolate. That's not directly referring to the Holocaust, but you can see the same sort of ideas of punishment that God would bring on this people for the way that they've treated his name. Also in Jeremiah 34 verse 15 and 16, it mentions one very specific thing, which I've got on the screen, that ye had made, so that what they were doing was they were surrounded by enemy armies, and at the time they were proclaiming that all servants can go free, and they were doing that in the name of God. In the house that's called by God's name, they had made a covenant that every servant can go free. But when the city was surrounded, when the army that was surrounding the city left, as it says, ye turned and polluted my name and caused every man his servant and every man his handmaid, who you'd set at liberty at their pleasure, to return, and brought them into subjection unto you for servants and for handmaids. So they'd polluted God's name because they'd broken a covenant. And isn't God's name all about keeping his covenant? So a people who breaks his covenant is polluting God's name. They were meant to bear God's name to the nations around. So what could God do? The people who were supposed to be upholding his reputation were dragging his name through the mud, polluting it. It would be like the Governor General committing murder. He's bearing the name of the king, so he has shamed the monarchy. And it's only right that he would be punished, and the king would have to swiftly distance himself from that activity. God's only option was to distance himself from their behaviour and punish them. Come to Jeremiah 16, our reading for tonight. It starts off listing a lot of these punishments as well, like we read in Jeremiah 7. In the early part of the chapter, verse 4, they shall die of grievous deaths. They shall not be lamented, neither shall they be buried, but they shall be as dung upon the face of the earth, and shall be consumed by the sword and by famine, and their carcasses shall be meat for the fowls of heaven and for the beasts of the earth. And it goes on all the way through to verse 9, similar to we read in chapter 7. Behold, I will cause to cease out of this place in your eyes and in your days the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride. That's a description of the suffering that Israel would suffer in the land, not when they went into captivity. But Deuteronomy 28 recounts a lot of the sufferings that they would have in captivity. You can stay in Jeremiah 16 because we're going to come back to it very briefly, but I'll read a couple of verses from Jeremiah 28 to show you what God said specifically about what would happen when they went into captivity. He says, thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. And that's exactly what they did become. And people were astonished. They would just talk about it. And the wandering Jew, as we'll see a little bit later, became a proverb of Jews around the way that they were treated. Verse 48 of this chapter says, therefore thou shalt serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee in hunger, thirst, nakedness, in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. And later on in the chapter again, verse 59, then Yahweh will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seeds, even great plagues of long continuance and of sore sickness. He will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt which thou wast afraid of. And verse 64, Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people, and among these nations thou shalt find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But Yahweh shall give thee a trembling heart, failing of eyes, sorrow of mind, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee. What apt descriptions of the Holocaust. Thou shalt have fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even. And at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. So that's the punishment that God would suffer. And verse 10 to 13 of Jeremiah 16, where we were, they say, wherefore shall, well, it repeats largely what we've talked about already, but they say, wherefore hath Yahweh pronounced against us all this great evil? Well, what is our iniquity? What is our sin that we've committed against God? And it's because they've forsaken God. They've done worse than their fathers and walked everyone in the imagination of their heart, doing things that would never be associated with God. They've tarnished his name. Now, this isn't even the first time that Israel experienced a Holocaust-type event. You'll notice that it talks a lot about Egypt in many of the quotes we're referred to, and we'll come back to that in a second. But when God sent Israel into captivity, he couldn't completely destroy his people, because that would be making him the very thing that Israel presented him to be, a covenant breaker. That would go against his reputation as a God who always would be the same and keep his promises. So God's solution is to punish Israel while keeping them as his people. Isaiah 48 verse 9 to 11 says, "For my name's sake I will defer mine anger, and for my praise will I refrain for thee." So he's just saying, I'm holding back for my name's sake. But he's still going to put them through this refining process in the furnace of affliction. But he says, it's for my own sake. For mine own sake will I do it. Because how should my name be polluted? If he breaks his covenant, his name's polluted as well. But if you come to Isaiah chapter 43, we can see he would still be with them through all of this. We've already been in Isaiah 43, so we know what it's about. The earlier verses, verse 1 and 2, God says, what it says, "But now thus saith Yahweh that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." Though individuals from Israel definitely were burned as they walked through the flames of the Holocaust, the nation itself never completely destroyed. Remember, Holocaust means a thing fully burnt. That's an image of Israel used back in Exodus, actually, of a bush continually burning but never being consumed. And the events of Exodus 1 are actually a foretaste of the Holocaust. That was the first of many times when a nation tried to commit genocide on the Jews. Exodus 1, Pharaoh first enslaved them, and he increased their affliction, and then he made sure every one of their baby boys was killed to try and wipe them out as a race. And 3 times in the Bible, Egypt and the Exodus, Egypt as the place that they escaped from, is referred to as the iron furnace. What an appropriate image for the first Holocaust, if you would like to call it that. And it's just as relevant to the second one, which featured iron furnaces in every death camp. Deuteronomy 4 verse 20, "Yahweh hath taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace." It's the same in 1 Kings 8 and Jeremiah 11. Egypt, the iron furnace, the midst of the furnace of iron. And each of these 3 quotes, as you can see highlighted, also contains a reference to Israel still remaining God's people. The process of going through the fiery trials and punishment was evidence that God were God's people. Any other people would be forgotten, either wiped out as a people or completely assimilated into the surrounding nation, losing their cultural identity. But not God's people. God was still with them, drawing them through every horrible event in their history. So World War II, along with all the other punishments the Jews endured, was the penalty for shaming God's reputation to the nations. While bearing the name of God, they committed the atrocities that God hated, so he punished them. But the very fact that Israel was in captivity, not in their own land, made a lot of people disrespect God and his promises anyway. In Ezekiel 36, it says that they profaned my holy name because the heathen, the nations around them, said, "These are the people of the Lord and are gone forth out of his land," as if they're saying, well, this is hardly a God who keeps his promises. He can't even keep them in their own land. They're gone into captivity. So he had pity for mine holy name. And this introduces the second purpose of World War II. It was undoubtedly a punishment, but it was also about bringing Israel back to the land. In Jeremiah 16, verse 15 to 16, which is, again, our reading for tonight, we can see where this goes. We stopped with the punishment, but it continues. Actually, we'll start in verse 14. So instead of punishment, therefore, behold, the days come that it shall no more be said, Yahweh liveth that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. So God will no longer be known as the God of the Exodus who brought Israel out of Egypt, but Yahweh that liveth that brought up the children of Israel from all the lands of the north and from all the lands whither he had driven them. And I will bring them again into the land that I gave unto their fathers. So God's now going to be known as the God that brought Israel back from Europe, from Russia, from all of the lands of the north that they lived in throughout thousands of years up to World War II. The world was not kind to the Jews at all through those years. And it seemed like, verse 6, I'll step back actually one moment. Verse 16 starts off by saying, I'll send for many fishers. And fishers, if you can picture the imagery of a fisher, it's someone who's baiting and trying to draw a fish in using bait. There were many fishers which were mentioned last week, leading to the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration by Britain, the monarch of Britain at the time, that His Majesty views with favour the establishment of a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine, because Britain had gained control of Palestine. But there were many barriers to that. While the fishers had done all of the work to try and bring Israel back to the land, to bait them back, there was anti-Semitic feeling rising in Europe after World War I, and that actually extended to England. There was a lot of anti-Semitic feeling in England as well. Even though Britain had control of Palestine after World War I as well, the administrative problems of setting up a Jewish homeland became overwhelming, and Britain kept putting it off, and it was also a diplomatic problem with the people who lived in the land at the time. And finally, many of the Jews in Europe were quite happy to be living their affluent lives in modern environments rather than moving to a barren land where they'd have to do back-breaking work, farming this swamp land. So that was the role. So the fishers were meant to bring them back, but everything is sort of stalled by the time we come to World War II. That's where the second part of verse 16 comes in. After the many fishers fish them, God says, after will I send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill and out of the holes of the rocks. Because that's where Jews were hiding. They were being hunted back. Fishers had completed their work with the Zionists laying the groundwork, but now God sent hunters to convince the Jews that they needed their own homeland where they would belong. When the war ended and the Jews were freed, there were these feelings of elation, like Psalm 126 reads, when Yahweh turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter and our tongue with singing. But that didn't really last long. They weren't dead, they realised. It was a miracle. But then they realised they weren't really alive either. They'd lost their lives. They'd lost every family member. They'd witnessed horrors they thought impossible. They'd lost their sanity. They'd lost their homes. 75 million people died during World War II. That's an estimate. But it's been said that while the rest of the world was counting the dead, the Jews were counting the living. Shoshana Stark, a survivor of the Holocaust, said, I went home. I didn't have anywhere I could stay. I had aunts and family, so I went to see all their apartments. There were non-Jews living in every one. They wouldn't let me in. In one place, one of them said, what did you come back for? They took you away to kill you, so why did you have to come back? I decided, I'm not staying here. I'm going. And where could they go? To the place that they had always loved. Jerusalem. They viewed their emigration to Israel as a repeat of the Exodus, exactly as it describes in Jeremiah 16. Because for instance, one of the most famous ships that took the illegal refugees, Jewish refugees back to Israel was named the Exodus. They saw it as their escape from the iron furnace. And God says that the emigration of the Jews back to Palestine was a witness to his existence. In Ezekiel 36, he says, "I do not this for your sakes, house of Israel, but for my holy name's sake, and that all nations shall know that I am Yahweh." It's all about God's name being retained. And all of this led to the declaration of the State of Israel, all the Jews back in the land in 1948, which is next week's lecture. But how did that actually happen because of World War II? Well, just briefly, as the horrors of the Holocaust became known, the world was motivated by various feelings to now support the establishment of a Jewish state. There'd been no other point in history where a majority of the world's nations would have supported the Jews. They were hated throughout history. Some felt compassion for the Jews and what they'd suffered. Many just felt personal guilt and shame for the world that they were a part of, what they'd done to the Jews. Many just wanted the Jews gone. But whatever the case was, God had worked to save his people and send them back to the land. I was going to do a small digression on the horrors, how God allows this horrible war to even happen at all, because that's a common question that people will ask of God. How does he allow this to happen? But unfortunately, I don't have time to cover that in detail. So there's a little booklet that you can look at afterwards, which covers it quite well, which Jono can show. But I'm also happy to discuss it afterwards if you would like. But we'll finish by reflecting on what we've considered. What's the Bible's view of World War II? It was undoubtedly to punish his people for their sins, for what they'd done to God's name. And it was also to set the environment necessary to bring them back to the land as he'd promised. The end result is in the rest of Jeremiah 16. Our reading is relevant throughout. And verse 17 mentions that mine eyes, this is God saying, mine eyes are upon all their ways. They are not hid from my face, neither is their iniquity hid from my eyes. At first I will recompense their iniquity and their sins double, because they have defiled my land. They have filled mine inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable things. So it recounts, this is what I'm doing, I'm punishing them, but his eyes are always on them. And then it flips to God being a strength, a fortress, a refuge in the day of affliction. That's what God was for the nation of Israel throughout the Holocaust. Maybe personally it didn't feel like that. Many Jews lost their faith because of the Holocaust, a belief in God at all. But as a nation, God brought them through it. And the end goal of all of this is the rest of the chapter. The Gentiles are going to come and this hasn't happened yet. We're still waiting after the day of affliction. The Gentiles shall come unto thee, to God, from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein is no profit. Shall a man make gods unto himself, and they are no gods? This is exactly what Isaiah 43 to 48 was all about. That the whole point of Israel was that all the world would know that there is only one God, and that they would look at God, at Israel, as God's witnesses, that there is only one God. And now the Gentiles are coming and saying, we realise how ridiculous our idols are, how ridiculous the things we serve, the things we spend time on really are. Shall a man make gods unto himself, and they are no gods? Therefore, verse 21, behold, I will this once cause them to know. I will cause them to know my hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is Yahweh. So God's purpose in Israel is finally fulfilled when all the world will know that God's name is Yahweh. So God's name, just briefly, is it only borne by Israel? Are Israel the only name bearers of God? Well, no. Revelation 22, verse 3 and 4. I'll skip through that, sorry. Revelation 22, verse 3 and 4 says that when there is no more curse, at the end of the kingdom, skipping to the end, his name shall be in their foreheads, in everyone's foreheads. Why in a forehead? Because the forehead is very visible. If you have something written on any part of your body, if you want it to be seen, the forehead is probably the part that is most visible. If someone looks at a person, they look at their face first. And written on the forehead, emblazoned on the forehead, the name of God, everyone would see. And that's, in a metaphor, exactly what God had wanted Israel to be. He had wanted them to have God's name written in their forehead, so everyone could see God when they saw Israel. So we now have a responsibility as God's name bearers. When we claim to be Christ's brothers and sisters, or claim to act as Christians, which is a label that contains the name of Christ, it means Christ's ones. God's name, through Christ, is either elevated or tarnished. Everything that we do in the name of Jesus Christ, we do bearing his and ultimately God's reputation. If we do or say something ungodly when we've publicly identified ourselves as God's name bearers, then we're profaning, polluting, defiling, shaming God's name. If we bear God's reputation poorly, others will want nothing to do with the God we claim to represent. But alternatively, if we show God's character of mercy, goodness, truth, justice, and bear his name well, we give him glory and show to the world that he is a good God. And that's what we as Christadelphians want to do to the world. As individuals, we know we're not perfect, but we would like everyone to look at us and see God's name metaphorically written in our foreheads. The growing disregard for God in the current age is not any fault of God's. It's the fault of those claiming to represent God who instead are damaging his reputation because they do things that he would never condone. And I've heard people personally say to me before, why would I want to believe in a God whose church tortured and killed people throughout the Middle Ages? That's a perfectly reasonable thing to think, because most people, the only way they see God is through the God's people on earth. So how do you take on God's name? Like a surname, you take on God's name by adoption into the family of God through Christ. And that's through baptism. We can be adopted and be called the sons and daughters of God, adopted into his family for eternal salvation. To close, I want to leave you with just one task. Every time you see or hear about Israel in the news, think about how miraculous their existence is. How did they survive the horrors of the Holocaust? The answer is God. God placed his name in them and declared them to be witnesses to his existence and to the fact that he keeps his promises. So whenever you see Israel, see God.